My name is Tracy Berardi, and I am Program Manager of the Cloud Council. Today we're welcoming Mr. Mike Edwards to give us a briefing on ISO Cloud Security and Privacy Standards. Mike is a Senior Technical Staff Member at IBM working on cloud computing and SOA standards, and he's also Chair of the UK Cloud Standards Committee with ISO SC 38. The presentation slides will be posted to the CSCC website this afternoon, so you're welcome to visit our site and download them. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and if you'd like to pose a question, please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar toolbar. And with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Mike. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everyone. So today's talk is about the ISO standards that talk about security and privacy for cloud computing services. And as it says on the first slide, these numbers will become very familiar. These are ISO 27017, ISO 27018, and ISO 27001, which are the principal standards that we'll be talking about today. So we move on to slide 2. Move to slide 3 with the abstract. So we'll look at the various ISO security and privacy specifications and their related certifications which apply to cloud services. We'll cover the sort of concerns on security and privacy that folks using cloud services have, the various standards and certifications that can apply to cloud services, and then we'll look in turn at the various standards that ISO has that are relevant, and we'll go over those in turn. Moving on to slide 4, just a few words about the Cloud Standards Customer Council. That's the organization that's organized the call today, and is a very active organization with over 500 organizations now belonging to it, and is designed to provide customers' view of the various cloud standards and to help provide feedback to the various standards organizations on customer concerns and customer viewpoints of various issues relating to cloud computing. And as you can see from this page, CSCC has been very active producing a whole stream of white papers and related documents that are relevant to cloud computing, starting back in 2011 with the original Practical Guide to Cloud Computing, and the Practical Guide to Cloud SLAs and Security for Cloud Computing, and has continued since 2011 delivering new papers which deal with particular topics. And some of the ones that are related to cloud security and privacy I've picked out in red on this page. So in 2013 we did the Cloud Security Standards paper. In 2015, we've already done an update to the Security for Cloud Computing white paper to relate the latest trends and directions that have happened in security for cloud computing. We've also got a practical guide to privacy for the public sector that's being produced this year as well, which is the first foray into privacy that CSCC has done as well. So lots of good things from the Cloud Standards Customer Council you can now read, and some of them relate indeed to security and privacy that we're talking about today. So moving on to slide 5, there are sort of 3 main takeaways that I'd like to come out of today's talk. The first one is to emphasize that security and privacy are key concerns for cloud service customers, and many of those customers demand proof of one kind or another in relation to any of the cloud services that they're likely to use. The second point is that both customers and providers need a public and open way of declaring the security and privacy capabilities of the cloud services they provide and use. And point 3 is that international standards such as 27001, 27017, and 27018 provide an open, worldwide, and customer-centered approach to making declarations about cloud services. So those tie together quite nicely, I hope. Moving on to slide 6. It's been clear for some time that security and privacy issues are one of the primary concerns that cloud service customers have, and have been an inhibitor in many cases to customers adopting cloud services where they didn't have a clear view of the security and privacy issues associated with using a cloud service. So here are a couple of charts based on surveys that were done previously, and we can see in both cases security and privacy of data are the top issues that customers have in relation to using cloud services. And that's true in my experience as well. I've talked to many customers over the years, and security and privacy concerns are right up there as major issues that they care about. And why that is all too clear from slide 7. These kinds of headlines that still turn up regularly of problems that have occurred with data breaches, security breaches, and important sensitive information getting out. Now, this one is not actually cloud related, but it just shows the kind of painful publicity that occurs when security breaches occur. And it's exactly the kind of thing you don't want to be happening when you're using a cloud service. You don't want your cloud service leaking information in this kind of way. So let's move on to slide 8 and start talking a little bit about standards and how they can be useful in dealing with this situation. So the first thing to understand is that there are many different kinds of standards making organizations. I'm today talking about standards produced by ISO, the International Standard Organization Standardization, which together with ITU, the International Telecoms Union, are recognized treaty-based organizations that are accepted around the world and have a somewhat special position because of their acceptance at international level. Basically, standards that are developed and produced by these organizations can be used, for example, by governments in government procurement without challenge. Anything that's a standard at that level is completely acceptable by the World Trade Organization, for example. However, they aren't the only standards making organizations by any means. There are standards making organizations at regional and national levels. So I have just a few of them on here. We have national-based bodies like BSI in the UK or ANSI in the USA. Then we have regional bodies like ETSI and CEN, which are European organizations that make standards. Probably even more active are the various fora and consortia, which are basically industry-based organizations set up by groups of companies, typically from various industries, and there are a whole host of those. Some will be perhaps quite well known to you: OASIS, WCC, and the IETF, for example, all involved very much with Internet-type standards. But there are lots more of them. TM Forum is an example of a body related to the telecom industry. Many telecom organizations belong to TM Forum, and they produce good standards that relate to telecoms in one way or another. So there are standards produced in all these different kinds of organizations. One of the interesting things that does happen is that some of the standards produced in the foreign consortia, for example at OASIS or WCC, can be put forward to the international standards bodies like ISO for formal publication as ISO standards and international standards, and that has happened to quite a number of the more significant standards produced in some of the fora and consortia. Moving on to slide 9, the standards bodies are not the whole story. In particular, there are groups of other organizations that are equally important. The CSCC that we've already talked about is one of them, and there's a similar one called ODCA, Data Center Association, both of which are related to cloud computing. And then we have the Cloud Security Alliance, which is specifically dedicated to work on cloud computing security. There are a whole series of certification organizations which create certifications often based on the standards that we're going to talk about. ISACA is one of them. There are plenty of others around as well who actually either derive or conduct certifications. And then there are also bodies involved in producing what you might call code-first specifications, and perhaps the classic example of that at the moment is HTML5, which is being done by being implemented first with the specification following the implementation, rather than coming up with a specification ahead of time and then implementing it. A different approach. And of course, there are a whole series of open source projects which operate in that kind of way. And some of the ones that are perhaps familiar to people in cloud computing would be OpenStack, which is an IaaS platform, infrastructure as a service platform, Cloud Foundry, which is a platform as a service offering, and Docker, which is an open source platform for providing containers virtualization. And all these, and indeed many more, are ways of defining open ways of doing things, which are often adopted across the industry. And a final comment about open source implementations, there is increasing pressure these days to ensure that there are open source implementations of many standards, particularly those involving protocols and data structures and APIs. And those need to be available for the final ratification of a standard, because they help ensure that the standard is implementable, it can actually be realized in standard implementations, and that interoperability is possible. Okay, so that's a look at organization. Let's now move on to look at some standards, and there are many different types of standards that are available in the marketplace that are useful for different purposes. So if we start at the top, there are many high-level governance and management type specifications available. And in fact, some of the ones that are that we're going to look at today are really of that type. So ISO 27001, 27018, 27017 that we talked about are high-level governance and management. They're not talking about detailed protocols. They're not talking about detailed data structures. They're instead telling you how to organize some particular area. So obviously, 27001 is about organizing information systems security, and equally then 27018 and 17 are dealing with data protection for cloud services, how to organize it, and security controls that are required for cloud services. There are then other types of standards that talk about architectures, and the one that's most relevant to cloud computing would be the ISO 17789 standard, the Cloud Computing Reference Architecture, that give you a description of the concepts and the components that go to make up some particular area of function, in this case cloud computing, that allow you then to be able to describe cloud computing systems in a consistent way and show you the relationships that exist between different components of the system. There are some security-related standards in this area as well. ISO has ISO 29101, which is a framework for privacy architecture, how to handle privacy and data protection in any system you may have in mind. Equally, there are others for management of identities, ID management reference architecture is at 24760 at ISO. And then down at the bottom of this diagram, there is a whole set of technology-specific standards and specifications which may exist, and these can exist either in some of those foreign consortia that we talked about earlier, or some of them are at ISO, but these deal with the nuts and bolts, the detailed technologies that you may need to implement in your systems. And they cover a huge range of stuff. So in the middle here, we have a whole series of ID and access management standards, things like OAuth2, OpenLDAP, Kerberos, that are used for ID and access management. There are a whole series of encryption standards. I've only got a very small number on this diagram. Triple DARES, AES, RSA, and so on. All of these that could be used for encrypting either data in transit or data at rest. And then there are other key technologies that are associated with this area. So X509 certificates, KMIP standard key management from Oasis, biometric interchange formats for handling biometric authentications and materials, which is the ISO 19794 standard, and SAML for handling security assertions. You may need to use some, or indeed all of these in some cases, when you're actually building real systems. They have their place within the higher level specifications like 27001, 27018, but those higher level specifications typically allow you to pick and choose the particular technology specific standards that you're going to use. So, 27001 may say you need to have authentication for users using the system, but whether you use OAuth2 or LDAP or Kerberos, that will often be your choice. So moving on from the standards and the specifications, another aspect of the environment you need to deal with here is certification. And certification is really all about providing assurance, typically to the users or customers of a system. And you're providing assurance either about the organization that's providing the service. In other words, the organization we have a proper process and we are following it correctly. Or you are wanting assurance about individuals, maybe a consultant or someone who comes along to help you. And then it's a question of knowing that the individual understands the area of concern and can implement whatever's required correctly. Certification is typically handled through audits in the case of organizations. Organizations get audited against some particular standard or audit scheme, whereas individuals will typically be examined. Their knowledge will be formally examined and they'll gain accreditation for whatever that certification scheme is covering. It's pretty typical for certification schemes to be associated with a standard. Probably the best known in the area of security is ISO 27001. But that doesn't have to be the case. It's possible for certification schemes to be defined separately from standards, and an example would be the CSA STAR certification, or the ISACA CISM, which is based on a certification scheme created by the certification body in that case. There's a whole variety of certifications available, and of course you may choose a particular certification depending on the particular concern or particular situation you find yourself in. So moving on to slide 12, why might you choose to use international standards rather than any others? And one of the main reasons for this is that they will be applicable anywhere in the world. And on the provider side, for the cloud providers, that's useful because the provider would then implement their systems once. certify themselves against an international standard once, and it will be generally accepted, not just in maybe their country of origin. The other point would be that these standards are valid according to the World Trade Organization rules, and using international standards avoids what you might call balkanization, where there may be very varying national and regional requirements. Ideally, an international standard would encompass all of those without requiring variations between each country. And then the second and very good reason for accepting international standards is that they are indeed well accepted by customers all around the world. Indeed, ISO 27001 is probably one of the best known standards in security, bar none. This also means that you can find plenty of skills and knowledge. It's very straightforward to find people who are skilled in ISO 27001, know how to apply it, know how to certify to it, and you have a very well-developed system, an ecosystem of auditors and certification authorities that support these standards as well. So it's not hard to find everything you require as a customer or a provider when you're using these international standards. Right, so we've talked about international standards at a high level, so if we move on to slide 13, as we see some of the cloud computing standards that exist or are under development at ISO. So on this chart, the items in black are already published, complete, in force. The items in red are still under development in one or other of the working groups at ISO that actually produces these standards. So, for example, we find the Cloud Computing Overview and Vocabulary and the Cloud Computing Reference Architecture, which give you an idea of what cloud computing is, how components in cloud computing are put together. They're available today. Further down, we find ISO 27001 and ISO 27002, which are the basic requirements from information security management systems, and then the code of practice for putting controls, specific technologies and techniques in place to provide information security in any given system. 27001 and 27002, they are the core of information security management as far as ISO is concerned. Those two are the basis for most of the other security and privacy management standards. Further down, we then find two existing published standards that relate to data protection and privacy. 29101 is the general privacy architecture framework, how to manage privacy when implementing information systems. And 27018 then is the code of practice for data protection controls for cloud computing services. Switching from the already published standards, we then look on the red items at things that are still under development and will be published in the future. We have 19086, which is the cloud computing SLAs, service level agreements standard. There's a cloud computing interoperable portability standard, 19941. There's a 19944 standard on data flow between cloud computing services and devices, in particular mobile type devices. Those are all under development in Subcommittee 38, which deals with cloud computing particularly. A bit lower down is then 27017, which is all about security controls for use in cloud computing, which is then based on 27002. That's still under development, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And then related to that one is another standard called 27036 Part 4, which is about information security in supplier relationships. And there is a specific part that deals with supplier relationships where we're talking about a cloud service customer and the supplier as a cloud service provider. So all those have a relationship to security and to privacy in relation to cloud services. Slide 14 is just the front page of the ISO 27001 standard to show you what they look like. One thing to point out with many of these standards, not all of them, but many of them, is that these are only available as price publications. The way the business model for ISO works is they cover their costs by making charges for the standards they produce, which is not ideal, but that's the way things work. So if you want to get hold of these standards, you have to pay a charge. You can go to the ISO website and buy them and download them. So having talked about them at a high level, if we move on to slide 15, we can start looking at then some of the details. So I'm going to start here with the ISO 27002 specification, because this is the core of what you need when you're either providing cloud services or indeed consuming them. Now, this one's called the Code of Practice for Information Security Controls, and basically it's going to lay out a series of controls that you need to have in place when you're providing an information security system or indeed using one. And there are control sets provided for a whole series of areas which are listed on this page. So we can talk about some of those. At the high level, it requires that you have a security policy in place. This is a management level thing. I expect you to have a clearly stated security policy that the whole organization is going to adhere to. Secondly, you need to have your information security organized. You need to have a management system in place and needs to have various characteristics. There then needs to handle asset management, the various assets including hardware, software, networks, and these need to be managed as assets. There are human resources. We should never forget that humans are a very, very important part of any information system, and there are requirements for what you need to have done in relation to the human resources that are dealing with or using the information systems. There are then physical and environmental controls required. Where do you keep your information systems? What kind of physical controls do you have? What kind of systems do you have in place to deal with faults, loss of power, flooding, all this kind of stuff? There are then a whole series of supplier relationships that need to be managed as part of information security. You're almost always acquiring hardware, software, services from places. What controls you need to have to ensure that what you're supplied is going to have the correct information security applied to it. There are then communications and operations considerations. There are considerations about management of the applications and services that you're using. There are needs to consider access control. ID and access management is a big aspect of information security. So a whole series of controls that need to be in place to deal with access control. There are controls that apply to the system acquisition, the development of systems, the maintenance of systems, both hardware acquisition but also software acquisition and indeed application development. We all hope that we will not run into trouble, but the reality is that, of course, things do go wrong on occasions, and this is where security incident management comes in, which is the next aspect that 27002 looks at handling. So it asks you to have controls in place that you have a system in place for managing security incidents that allows you to identify when they occur, and once they've occurred, to have a process in place for dealing with them and fixing them. It also requires you to have controls in place to deal with business continuity. One of the biggest issues you can run into with IT systems is if they fail and their facilities are no longer available to run the business, and those can threaten your business, and you need to have appropriate procedures and controls in place to deal with business continuity. And then last but not least is the need to have compliance. There are all kinds of rules and regulations and laws that may apply to you when either using or providing services and information management systems, and compliance needs to be handled as well. So it's quite a big document, covers a lot of material. If we look then in slide 16, we can see sort of sample controls that are present in the 27002 standard. And at high level, these look fairly simple, but they are quite telling. So the very first one I picked up is all information security responsibilities should be defined and allocated. Sounds straightforward enough, but obviously it calls for a plan to exist that identifies the various security responsibilities, writes them down, and then allocates responsibilities to appropriate roles and individuals in many cases. And you must have controls in place that have all that stuff. And then the second one, again, sounds simple, but needs to be done. Assets associated with information and information processing should be identified, and there should be an inventory of the assets drawn up and maintained. So you know what assets you have, you know where they are, who's responsible for them. And then the third one here, conflicting duties and areas of responsibility should be segregated to reduce opportunities for unauthorized or an unintentional modification or misuse of assets. This separation of duties, separation of responsibilities is an important aspect of information security. And this spelled it out. So there are more controls, sample of controls on slide 17 as well, just to show you the kind of breadth that ISO 27002 goes to in addressing information security. If you move to slide 17, please. Oh, good, thank you. So this shows that we will have things like formal user registration and deregistration procedure, formal change control where change has to be managed, that information security should be to be handled in accordance with a set of documented procedures. All sounds simple in a way, but it has to be done and has to be done correctly in order to meet the requirements of ISO 27001. These are the sorts of things that are checked by someone who's an auditor who's certifying your organization against ISO 27001. And it can take quite a long procedure to go through all the controls and verify that indeed your organization is following all the requirements here and has all of the various requirements in place. And once you've done that, of course, then an auditor can issue a certificate that says, yes, you're doing all these things correctly, you have an appropriate security management system in place. It's likely that you're going to be able to handle, provide the service correctly and be able to handle information appropriately. And then if we flip to slide 18, what that might look like then is once you've had the auditors in and they're happy with you, they will issue a certificate like the one we see on slide 18. This is one that actually SoftLayer, which is division within IBM, this is what they obtained for all their data centers. And in fact, you can see there's a big long list of the data centers named by geography that they achieved ISO 27001 certification for. And Coalfire, in this case, is the name of the auditors and the certificate issuing authority. And indeed, there at the bottom is the signature of the guy at Coalfire who actually issued the certificate. All very official. And in fact, if you then chose to, you could actually go back and find this certificate on a more general website that lists all the certifications that we gained against 27001. So you could be assured that, yes, it is indeed official. So that gives you a flavor then. We've got 27001 as the basic set of requirements for information system management. 27002 has the detailed lists of controls or things you need to have in place in your organization. And then we have the certification that can be done against that and certificates being issued for either your organization or, in this case, for a cloud service that you're going to depend on. Now, moving on to slide 19. ISO 27001 and 27002 are completely general. They're not specific to cloud computing, and they're not specific to security and privacy issues in cloud computing. There's been a need, as cloud computing has become established, a need to extend the standards 27001 and 27002 to deal with some specific issues that arise from cloud computing. And the diagram on slide 19 tries to get at some of those issues. The situation is, in cloud computing, that the cloud service customer is using services provided by one or more cloud service providers. And inevitably, this leads to a split of security responsibilities between the customer and the provider, because the customer has some data, some in-house systems, and then is placing some of their applications, some of their data into the systems provided by the provider. And inevitably, some capabilities reside with the provider, some capabilities reside with the customer. And this split of responsibilities is the problematic area, the bit that needs to be addressed specifically for cloud computing. And this has caused then the need to have additional standards that are represented by, for example, ISO 27017 for security and ISO 27018 for privacy. So let's first move to slide 20, and we'll look a little bit at ISO 27017, which is the has a snappy title of Information Security Controls for the Use of Cloud Computing Services. So it's clear that we're talking about information security and cloud computing. It's based on ISO 27002. So the basic position is all of the controls that you find in that basic ISO 27002 specification, they still apply for cloud services. But there is added information for both cloud service customers and cloud service providers about what they need to think about in relationship to all those controls. And in some cases then, those controls are extended. Additional information, additional control is specified for cloud computing, and some of those extended control sets are listed here. And I think the top one is kind of summarizes the overall theme, which is there are extra management control and coordination required due to the security responsibility split. So we think, for example, about ID and access management. Fundamental thing, you've got to authorize people, they want to authenticate themselves and authorize them before they use any particular capability. And if that capability is part of a cloud service, then on the one hand, the customer needs to be deciding who is to provide access to any given cloud service or cloud service capability. But it's likely that the ID and access management system itself is being controlled by the cloud service provider. So on the one hand, the administrators of the cloud service customer have to ensure all the right users and only the right users are given access, but the system itself has to be implemented by the cloud service provider. And so there have to be some extra controls in place to ensure that the right things are being done on the customer side and on the provider side. The second point is, on the second bullet here, is about control of risk to shared facilities. One of the fundamental points about cloud computing is typically when you as a customer use cloud services provided by a provider, you're sharing those facilities to some extent with other customers. It's one of the cost benefits of cloud computing is due to things being shared. So there are potential risks associated with that. You don't want your data, your applications being used by other customers of the cloud service provider. So there needs to be extra control in place to ensure that doesn't happen. There are questions about the handling of mobile code, questions about how authentication is done for cloud service use, how things are handled at application level when you're running an application in the cloud service environment, data running in-house, how you ensure validation and message integrity. There's then some higher impact controls, which are listed down the bottom here. The biggest one is the requirement for access to audit logs with specified data available from those audit logs. One of the problems you get into with cloud computing is that the cloud services themselves are being run inside the cloud provider's environment. So how do you as a customer get access to appropriate audit information that is only about your use or your users' use of the cloud service and no one else's? You need access to logs to find out who's been using the services to do what, but you shouldn't be able to see any other customer's use of those cloud services. There's requirements to have non-disclosure of communications going on, particularly between the customer and the cloud service. There needs to be facilities for the customer to monitor usage of the cloud services. And there needs to be protection of tools relating to audit, so they can't be tampered with. Particularly, you don't want any tampering of audit logs by either the provider staff or by other customers. So a whole series of additional controls required for cloud security. Now let's move on and look at privacy and data protection in slide 21. It's worth just getting a few terms sorted out here, which is what this slide's about. When dealing with personal data, the data subject is the person whose data is related to the personal data. That's the first concern. The data controller is the term used for the organization that is gathering the personal data. So, you know, if a company keeps personal data about its employees, you know, HR records, then the company is the data controller. They are deciding what data they have to gather for what purposes, and they have to typically let the data subjects, the people, know that that data has been gathered and why it's been gathered and what it's going to be used for. And then on the other hand, on the right-hand side, we have a data processor. That's an organization that may be actually storing or processing the data for whatever purposes the data controller needs. Now, in the cloud computing world, it is typically the cloud service customer that's the data controller, and the cloud service provider that's typically the data processor. And why it's worth spelling these things out is that personal data and privacy rules are heavily regulatory focused. Governments care a lot about this stuff. There are laws and regulations in place that control how data is gathered, what it can be used for, what the data controller has to enable the data subject to do, to know about what data has been gathered, or even to see the data modified. However, not all of the burden necessarily falls just on the customer. Some of it can fall on the cloud service provider as a data processor, and some of the rules that are in place then have to be reflected in appropriate data protection standards like the ones at ISO. So moving on from slide 21 to slide 22, we can now look at the ISO 2718 specification, which is code of practice for data protection controls for cloud computing services. And this is all about aiming to help cloud service customers and cloud service providers meet their requirements under data protection rules. So there are many of these regulatory requirements around. We talked about European Union in particular has a fairly strict set of data protection regulations. And this specification aims to address those in a general way. It's not specific just to the European standards. And do it in the context of public cloud services, where there's a clear split between the cloud service customer as the data controller and the cloud service provider as a data processor. Again, as with ISO 27017, this is based on ISO 27002, but adding in a specific set of extra controls and considerations for the handling of personal data. And some of them are fairly straightforward, like if you have a test environment for your application or service, then that should not contain PII, because there's a danger of, in test environments, things not being perfect. That's what tests are for, to check for bugs. And the danger would be if you had PII in your test environment, that it could get out. So you shouldn't have PII in a test environment, as an example. There should need to be authorization and tracking of removable media that contain PII. So how that might come about is it's not uncommon for a customer to send large volumes of data to a cloud service provider, not through a data connection over the internet, but actually to physically send them on media, because the data rates are such that it's much more cost-effective and faster to do it, in that way than to use the internet. But in that case, those removable media need to be properly authorized, encrypted, controlled, and so on. And then, third item, logs. When you're dealing with systems that have PII data, those logs could contain PII data. They could contain information about people, and if you've got that going on, then special control of those logs is required. You don't want the logs to be a way that personal information can leak out. So a whole series of additional controls there. And then on slide 23, the next slide, there are a set of what I would describe as higher impact added controls. The top one is one of the more important ones, which is that personal data should only be processed in accordance with the instructions of the controller. Basically, this is a way of saying it should not normally be the case that the cloud service provider can just go and use PII data in any way they choose for their own purposes, for, say, marketing purposes or something like that. So that needs to be clearly stated in the cloud service agreement between the customer and the provider, that any personal data that's there can only be used for the purposes agreed by the customer as a controller. There should be a monitoring log with specific details when PII gets changed. So if you have a cloud service that contains PII and then there's an update function where the PII can be altered, then that should be logged. You should know who did it and when. There are more obvious things, but in here, like any PII transmitted over public networks should be encrypted. There should be a document policy about the places, geographical areas where PII can be stored, often because regulations and laws have limits on where you're allowed to store personal information. So there needs to be a policy then stated by the cloud service provider that relates to that. That's another example. So 2718, fairly detailed, but all there to assist the customer and the provider get it right for the handling of PII in cloud services. And we can think of a number of cloud services today that are absolutely full of personal information. They're set up for that. There are, for example, my own company, IBM, has HR services as cloud services. Well, all that data is personal data of one kind or another. And then even quite so obvious, but Salesforce.com. I mean, there's personal information about sales contacts and so on being contained in there kind of information. So very relevant to many cloud services. So moving to slide 24, I think the whole point of these sorts of standards is they're there to help customers, providers do a good job with cloud service, because customers ultimately will only use services that they trust. And these standards and the certifications that relate to them are a good way of achieving trust for cloud services, both for security and then for the handling of personal data. So that's I think, a sketch of those standards, how they apply, and I think now would be a good time to open the floor to various questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. We do have a couple questions. Let's see. First, when will ISO 27017 Cloud Security Standard be available?
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah. Yeah, I may have noticed that if we went back to that slide when I had the sort of list of standards, some of which were finished, some of which are still in progress. The ISO 27017 standard that I've been talking about, it isn't formally published yet, it's still in process. It's looking like that it will be available before the end of this year, looking at the place it is in the process. It's taken a little bit more time to agree all the details of the 27017 standard. 27018 was published in the third quarter of last year, and it would have been nice if 27017 could have gone out at the same time. But cloud services are very diverse, unfortunately, and to get everything agreed between the various interests in cloud services is taking longer, and so it's likely that 27017 will be available at the end of this year. Okay, great.
And how do you see the relationship between ISO 27017 and SAS0 Type 2 / SOC2 reports? Does ISO 27017 provide guidance on suitable CC controls that can be referenced in these reports? I'm sorry if I botched the acronym there.
Could you do the acronym again? Just a moment.
SAS0 Type 2 / SOC2 reports. So what's the relationship between?
Okay, yeah, SOC2 is an example. Yeah. So we talked about before that there are various certification schemes for security in particular, but more generally. So SOC2 is another of the schemes that's used for security, and it's kind of broadly equivalent in its area of applicability to 27002. So it's not cloud specific. That's the first thing to say about it. But it is information security specific. So there's a broad compatibility between those two. That's ISO 27001, 27002, and SOC2. And you will often find cloud service providers like IBM, like Microsoft, and so on, providing multiple certifications. So I'm pretty sure Software, for example, has a SOC 2 certification as well as 27001. They're just more popular in some parts of the world. 27001 is probably the most popular in Europe. It's very heavily used around Europe. But SOC 2, for example, is quite popular in the USA. But they're broadly similar. They have the similar sorts of requirements. The same sorts of controls have to be in place in order for you to gain the certification. If you want a detailed comparison, I think there are some comparisons available on the web that can allow you to see what the similarities and differences are. I don't have a URL in front of me now, but I could probably find them later.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. A question that just came in. Do you have a view about how suitable ISO standards are for small and medium enterprises? For example, small organizations may be data controllers, it's difficult for them to understand the complexity of 27018. Likewise, small or medium-sized enterprise trying to understand the adequacy of ISO 27001 certification may be completely out of their depth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, certainly, I think it's generally true that small and medium organizations are going to struggle to find the right skills to understand any of these certifications and what they mean in detail. On the one hand, I think they should take some assurance that when they look at a particular cloud service, if it's got certifications of these kinds, 27001, 27018, and so on, that they know that the provider has gone through quite a substantial amount of work to get that certification, and so they can have some assurance that the security or the privacy is likely to be adequate. Of course, whether the security or the privacy handling is suitable for any particular use they have in mind, that's another question altogether. And the problem can be that there may be regulations or requirements depending on what kind of industry you're in. So if you're an SME that's having to do with healthcare, for example, then there are typically a whole set of additional rules that apply to you, whether you like it or not. So in the States, there are HIPAA requirements. And you may need to ask your cloud service provider, if you're going to use a cloud service, for the kinds of data that falls under those specialized regulations. You may need to go and ask them, is this service good for HIPAA or whatever other regulations that apply to you? I'm afraid there's no easy way around that one. But at a plus point, many small, medium enterprise organizations can find it difficult to find all the right skills, the right staff to do security and privacy handling for them. If they are using cloud services that are already certified to various of these standards, they're actually likely to be in a better position because a cloud provider who's gone through the certification certainly has the staff who understand this stuff. They did never get the certification in the first place, so if they didn't. So they could actually be improving that handling of security, that handling of personal data by using certified cloud services.
Mike, we have a flurry of questions that just came in. It looks like it's we're at the hour. We did capture these questions, and we could follow up after the webinar. And I do want to let everyone know that the presentation will be posted to the CSCC website this afternoon. And I'll go ahead and send a link to everyone that signed up for the webinar. So you'll have that coming to you. So thank you. And thanks again, Mike. That was a really great overview. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. If you're not yet a member of the Cloud Standards Customer Council, please consider joining us. Membership is free, and you're welcome to attend future events.
By the way, if you flip to slide 26 just before we finish, all the various CSCC white papers are available. They're freely available as downloads. There are links there, nice short links, which get you to them. And some of the answers, some of the questions that have been asked so far are actually to be found in the Cloud Standards white paper. Security Standards one. So these can be good reading. If you haven't read them already, they may be able to answer some of the questions that have been asked.
Great, thanks. Yeah, for pointing that out. These can all be found too on our website. There's a resource hub section that you can click to from the homepage. Perfect. Okay then. Is that all, Mike? Did you have any other last-minute thoughts? Or?
No, I mean, there, as well as the links here, there are a couple of other useful links at the end of the slides, but we don't need to go into those now. Once the slides are available, anyone can use them.
Okay, perfect. Yep, some helpful links here. So we'll send these around. And everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.